お時間になりました。皆様。
Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to start. Please be seated. We now start the symposium organized by the Japan Institute of International Affairs and sponsored by Japan Center for Asian Historical Records on the formation of the San Francisco system from occupation to peace. To start with, on behalf of the organizers, the Acting Director General Yasunori NAKAYAMA of JIIA will be making opening remarks. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining today's History Symposium organized by the Japan Institute of International Affairs. I'm Acting Director General Nakayama of JIIA. In order to grapple with issues on history, the Institute started to hold various symposium research projects from last year. And last year, we focused upon history and reconciliation as well as history and memory. In the current fiscal year, we picked up the San Francisco system as one of the themes. Why are we focusing upon the San Francisco system at this timing? The international order has been shaken, that has been pointed out, and San Francisco system, which is the starting point of the current system, is something that we should go back to at this point in time. As you are well aware, before and after the signing of the San Francisco Treaty, or the history of the occupation peacemaking period, the research has been conducted over that situation from the point of view of history of Japan-U.S. relations. In recent years, however, various documents and materials have been publicly disclosed in Europe and Asia, and significant progress in research has been made. And I look forward to the speeches and discussions from the experts present here today on the perspectives not just from the former Allied powers that were parties to the San Francisco Treaty, but also from the East Asian countries that are not parties to the treaty. Today's symposium is rather ambitious in terms of its contents, and the schedule is also very tight as well. But I hope it will be a fruitful one, including various views from various experts. Lastly, in holding this symposium, the NAJ, the National Archives of Japan, Japan Center for Asian Historical Records, is a sponsor of this one, so I'd like to extend my thanks to them. So that concludes my opening remark. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. In holding this symposium, Mr. Masahisa Sato, the Vice Minister of the Foreign Affairs, has given us congratulatory remarks. We are grateful for that. Now we would like to move on to keynote speech. The keynote speaker today is Professor Michael SCHALLER, Professor Emeritus of the University of Arizona. Professor SCHALLER, please come up to the stage. Professor Michael SCHALLER obtained a PhD in 1974 from the University of Michigan. From that year on to 2017, he taught at the University of Arizona. His area of specialty is U.S. diplomatic history and the history of U.S.-East Asian relations. He authored many books, including The Origin of the Cold War in Asia, The American Occupation of Japan, Douglas MacArthur, The Far Eastern General, The Altered States, the United States and Japan since the occupation, to name a few. Now, Professor SCHALLER, please.
Thank you for coming to listen to me, and I want to thank the Japan Institute of International Affairs for the kind invitation. Before I begin, I'd just like to say one thing. My perspective on the peace treaty and its aftermath was shaped by largely reading American and British documents on the period. And although American and British diplomats made an effort to describe Japanese perspectives on peace treaty issues, it obviously was limited by their own background. And so what I'm going to talk about largely reflects how largely American policymakers viewed the San Francisco Peace Treaty, its origins, and its immediate aftermath. So I apologize for that perspective. In 1951, during talks in Tokyo to nail down the details of an upcoming Japanese peace treaty, the American negotiator John Foster Dulles talked widely with a group of American and Japanese officials in Tokyo. And a point he made in many conversations was that unless a way could be found for Japan to prosper without dependence on communist China or dependence on American assistance, Japan would end up, as he put it, working for the other side. Like many U.S. policymakers, Dulles deemed preventing Japan's drift towards neutralism or some sort of accommodation with the communist world the prime objective of American foreign policy. And this determination to develop and hold Japan as an American ally was based on both geopolitical as well as ideological considerations. It also shaped American policy in Asia for a generation. It inspired Washington's policy of isolating China from the world, and it inspired the formation of numerous military alliances in East Asia and the Pacific. Above all, Americans' concern with holding Japan as an ally underlay America's escalating involvement in Vietnam from 1950 onwards. As a scholar, I found it somewhat remarkable that the three pillars of American assumptions about post-war Japan were all incorrect in fundamental ways. China, which Americans believed would try to blackmail or lure Japan into a communist alliance, during the 1950s had very limited interest in trading with Japan one way or the other. Maoist economics were largely focused on internal development or trade with the Soviet bloc. The second pillar of American belief was that Southeast Asia was vital for Japan's immediate recovery, not just its long-term prosperity. And yet, as we know, in the 1950s, right through the early 1960s, Southeast Asia played a minor role as a source of raw materials or trade with Japan. And the third pillar of American beliefs surrounding the peace settlement was that Japan could never successfully trade with the United States or Western nations. And of course, that also turned out to be quite untrue as early as the mid-1950s. So it was ironic, in a sense, that the foundations of America's belief about the peace settlement were all wrong in many ways. The American-drafted peace accord, signed by 48 nations in San Francisco, has been praised, and rightly so, for a generosity of spirit that welcomed a peaceful Japan back into the community of nations. However, it's important to recall that only two major nations that fought Japan in the Second World War, the United States and Great Britain, actually signed the treaty. The United States barred the People's Republic of China from attending. The Indian and Burmese governments boycotted the peace conference, although they later signed separate treaties with Japan. And the Soviet Union and its satellites attended but refused to sign the final document. Washington was actually quite pleased by this. Soviet refusal to sign the peace treaty meant that unresolved issues such as the Northern Territories and the return of Japanese prisoners of war would remain a festering sore between Japan and the Soviet Union for a decade or more. These issues, as I say, remained a running sore. The other factor was the Americans were pleased that the Soviets didn't sign because it deflected attention from America's retention of Okinawa for the next 2 decades. Also, sharing the anxiety of many other Asian people, the governments of the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand originally also refused to sign the treaty unless they were given separate assurances by the United States for treaties protecting them against future communist as well as potential Japanese aggression. So, in spite of its genuine virtue, the 1951 peace treaty cannot be fully understood in isolation. The restoration of Japanese sovereignty comprised a major element in a much broader framework of U.S. diplomatic, military, and economic arrangements that both reflected and in some ways outlasted the Cold War. Historian John Dower, among others, has referred to this as the 1951 San Francisco system, a set of arrangements that both limited Japan's autonomy and defined its relationship with the United States and its Asian neighbors for many years. I would go somewhat even further than that. To understand this, I refer to an armature of containment. An armature is a sort of unseen skeleton. My mother was a sculptor, and as a child she pointed out to me that you only see the outside of a sculpture, but you have to look at what the artist is doing. Inside is a metal framework, a skeleton, upon which everything else is built. And so I would say that the armature of containment resembles in some ways a set of Russian nesting dolls. At its core was the 1951 peace treaty with Japan. But despite its generous terms, it didn't exist in isolation. The United States, of course, kept control of Okinawa for 2 decades. And when we move one step further out from the peace treaty, we find over time a whole series of agreements that supplemented it. The 1951 treaties with the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand. We go one step further out. We find the 1953 Security Treaty with South Korea, 1954, the U.S. treaty with Taiwan. And enveloping all of these other treaties was the 1954 SEATO Treaty, signed by Dulles, which inserted a protocol promising American protection for the emerging state of South Vietnam. These concentric rings of security represented a shield and a tripwire. But equally important, they represented a strategic economic zone, as the Americans saw it, that by early 1948 and 49, Americans were referring to privately as the Great Crescent. Without Japan at its core, all of these treaties were meaningless. They were all deemed to safeguard Japan and, by extension, U.S. security. And I would argue that the 2 major wars fought in Asia by the United States after 1945, the Korean War and later the Vietnam War, were both fought for and partly from Japan. This so-called armature, a skeleton network of containment, radiated in time and space from the 1951 peace settlement. And they were all designed, in the words of John Foster Dulles, to keep Japan on our side, as he put it. From 1948 until the mid-1960s, a series of American presidents worried that economic vulnerability alone, not Chinese or Soviet military power, was the true threat to Japan and its alliance with the United States. Japan would be threatened by either locking it out of Southeast Asia or forcing it into trade with China. And these were the great American fears that might happen. On the eve of John Foster Dulles' trip to Tokyo in 1951, Newsweek magazine, then one of the 2 great American news journals, published an insider account, as they put it, of the upcoming treaty negotiations in Tokyo. The magazine cover pictured a smiling photograph of an elegantly dressed Prime Minister Yoshida Shigeru standing in a scholarly pose alongside a giant bowl of chrysanthemums. The title of the article was Japan, Late Enemy into Latest Ally, and it explained that the key American goal in Asia was to be certain that in the coming world showdown, Japan would cast its lot with the West, not the communist East. The article, which was written probably with Dulles' cooperation, made the point that Japan had reemerged after defeat as the most formidable nation in East Asia. And it included two sets of maps, the article included. One set was a military map showing how air and naval bases in Japan could dominate Northeast Asia, including Manchuria, Siberia, Korea, and coastal China. The second set of maps in the article was superimposed on Japan's wartime co-prosperity sphere. The article went on to say that with China behind the Iron Curtain, Japan must look to Southeast Asia as its source for coal, iron, soybeans, and other raw materials that were formerly purchased from China. Fighting communism in Korea and Indochina, the authors of the article said, was part of the evolving Japanese-American alliance. In soothing public remarks upon his landing in Tokyo in February 1951, Dulles praised Japan as a friendly country to be consulted, not one dictated to by victors. But he also recognized that progress towards a peace treaty would be difficult without acceding to the demands of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff, who wanted to retain extensive base rights in Japan. In effect, the Newsweek article, those two maps, one showing bases radiating to control Asia, and the other showing trade patterns in the Asian future, were on Dulles' mind. How do you balance off those two factors? And he confided to aides that his principal problem was not getting the Japanese to agree to a peace treaty, but by getting the American military to agree to a peace treaty. The question he said he had to answer was, do we, the United States, get the right to station as many troops as we want, where we want, for as long as we want, or do we not? At the same time, Dulles, like most American diplomats, recognized that Japan's long-term value to the United States was not simply as a forward military base. And he argued quite persuasively that rebuilding and protecting Japan's industrial potential was far more valuable than using it as a military outpost. The principal problem for Japan, Dulles said, was how, with China now in communist hands, it could prosper without becoming a permanent burden to the United States. Southeast Asia, he speculated, could provide Japan with vital markets and raw materials. But communism threatened there as well. Unless the United States made sure, as he put it, Japan worked for us, it would work for the other side. With foreign policy attention in the Truman administration focused for 2 years on other issues, problems in Western Europe, problems in the Near East, the Chinese Civil War, Washington provided relatively little oversight to General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers and occupation chief in Japan. Strangely, even as Cold War tensions increased in Europe and the Near East, both MacArthur and a working group in the State Department thought in terms of an early peace treaty with Japan, although they thought in diametrically opposed directions. A small working group in the State Department produced a draft treaty in mid-1947, a draft peace treaty. It proposed an extended period of international oversight of Japan, leading to a gradual 25-year return of sovereignty. During this 25-year-long transition, members of the Far Eastern Commission, including the Soviet Union, would closely monitor Japan to prevent its restoration of military or economic domination of East Asia. The State Department actually issued an invitation to all members of the Far Eastern Commission in the July of 1947, to attend a peace conference. Fortunately, for the perspective of the Truman administration, virtually every member of the Far Eastern Commission refused to attend. Not just the Soviet Union, but other nations as well thought it was premature. even stranger was, even as the State Department was issuing this tentative or provisional call for a peace conference, acting on his own, General MacArthur offered a completely diametrically opposed map of future settlement with Japan. He called for a peace conference to be held in Tokyo early in 1948, presided over by himself. The timing reflected both his plan to exit Japan and run for the presidency as a Republican, as well as acting before the Truman administration could implement any new policies in Japan. MacArthur was worried because on March 12, 1947, President Harry Truman addressed Congress and issued a dramatic call to provide economic, military, and other assistance to Greece, Turkey, and any other nation threatened by communist expansion. The so-called Truman Doctrine, as it became known, formed just one element of a more pervasive effort to contain Soviet influence by restoring German and Japanese economic strength. MacArthur had no principled opposition to the Truman Doctrine. He didn't really disagree with it, but he bitterly disagreed with any move to limit his autonomy acting in Japan and any move to delay or extend the occupation beyond early 1948. First privately and then publicly, MacArthur described a three-stage peace program for Japan, the first two stages of which had already been accomplished: demilitarization and democratization. The final stage, economic recovery, he said, could only occur not during an occupation, but after an occupation ended. And he dismissed as technical issues questions like reparations to Japan's wartime victims, restructuring the Japanese industrial combines, and so forth. He also dismissed all security questions. MacArthur declared that in the future, a neutral Japan could be protected by simply a declaration of neutrality and what he called its advanced spirituality, that the United Nations would be in charge of protecting Japan from any future threats. The Soviet Union, he insisted, could be trusted to respect a neutral Japan under a cloak of United Nations promise of security. He also told his aides that Truman and Secretary of State George Marshall wanted to extend the occupation not to help Japan, but to undermine MacArthur's attempts to run for president. On March 17th, 1947, just days after Truman had issued the so-called Truman Doctrine, MacArthur held one of his rare on-the-record press conferences in Tokyo, and he called for ending the occupation promptly and demanded that the Truman administration cease what he described as economic warfare against Japan. Under his leadership, MacArthur insisted, Japan had achieved a spiritual revolution and could rely upon advanced spirituality for its protection. Both the State Department plan for a restrictive treaty and MacArthur's call for an immediate peace settlement cut directly against what was being developed in Washington. And as I say, fortunately for the Truman administration, all the members of the Far Eastern Commission objected to both versions of this peace treaty. Between the summer of 1947 and the end of 1948, the Truman administration, through its leading officials, Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, the Army Secretary Kenneth Royal, Undersecretary William Draper, George Kennan, the new head of policy planning in the State Department, dramatically altered occupation policies for both Germany and Japan. While their best-known initiatives, the Marshall Plan in Europe and NATO, focused on Europe, James Forrestal, the new Secretary of Defense, stressed in his diary that everything he and his colleagues said about European recovery applied with equal force to Japan. It was vital, Forrestal said, to break the grip of General MacArthur in Tokyo and keep him from wrecking Japan and inviting Soviet intervention. This became American policy very quickly. In May of 1947, Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson warned that there was a grim fact of reality in the world. The two great economies of Europe and Asia in Japan were weak, and those great workshops of Europe and Asia, upon which he said the ultimate recovery of the two continents depends, these workshops must be restored. In June, Secretary of State George Marshall called for funding the European Recovery Program, or Marshall Plan. MacArthur responded to these initiatives by unveiling a dramatic alternative to everything Washington proposed. He dusted off a long-ignored proposal known as FEC 230 that called for a radical restructuring of the Japanese economy by breaking up industrial combines. And he demanded the Japanese government approve that plan. MacArthur's proposal to upend Japan's industrial structure stunned the Truman administration. George Kennan, the new influential head of the policy planning staff, approaching the peak of his power in Washington, warned members of Truman's cabinet that MacArthur had begun what he called a socialization attack on Japan. His call for a peace treaty and his economic ideas would create anarchy, Kennan wrote, and destroy the major barrier to Soviet expansion in Asia. Japan, Kennan said, could only gravitate in one of two directions, into the Soviet orbit or into the American orbit. And the survival of the free world depended on rebuilding the countries we have just destroyed. Kennan's staff recoiled at the prospect of an American exit from Japan. The policy planning staff informed Dean Acheson, George Marshall, and Truman that the radically changed world situation required, and these were their words, that Hirohito's islands be made a buffer state, not a neutral in the coming Cold War. As communist control of Northeast Asia spread, Moscow, they predicted, would likely use raw materials as a lever for political pressure against Japan, unless Japan obtained vital raw materials elsewhere, particularly in Southeast Asia. In short, the occupation must continue until Japan became internally stable, amenable to American leadership, and industrial revived. The new Japan, Kennan's staff wrote, would not possess an identity of its own, but would function as an American satellite. And this alone could assure the survival of non-communist Asia. Truman, who faced dismal re-election prospects in 1948, declined to do anything against MacArthur until the spring of 1948. MacArthur did run for president, but he lost a series of presidential primaries in the spring of 1948 and suspended his presidential campaign. Truman almost immediately authorized the Army and State Department to initiate, of course, what became known as the reverse course in Japan. In the middle of 1948, the policy planning staff put into words this new policy, known as NSC 13.2. It was approved by Truman in October of 1948, and it proclaimed that the primary American objective in Japan was economic recovery and military security. New State Department and Army administrators implemented this policy following the adoption of NSC 13.2. Congress followed suit by passing a large economic recovery program that was coupled with the Marshall Plan, the better-known Marshall Plan, Economic Recovery in Occupied Areas, it was called, passed in the summer of 1948 to provide capital and raw materials for Japanese recovery. Well, there was much talk occasionally of an Asian Marshall Plan, but that, of course, was nullified by the fact that Asia was politically disorganized in ways that didn't resemble Western Europe. The fighting that began in Korea in 1950 and lasted until 1953 briefly turned Washington's attention northwards. But even then, the notion of Japan as the pivot of this American Great Crescent stretching from Hokkaido to Pakistan remained a staple among American planners. Kennan's chief deputy on Asia, John Davies, described the challenge in a 1948 assessment. The United States, he wrote, must employ Japan's economy as an instrument of political warfare with respect to communist Asia, acquiring necessary raw materials for U.S. strategic and economic requirements, developing economic stability and independence among Western Europe and Pacific Islands, and encouraging the flow of raw materials from Southeast Asia to Japan and Western Europe. In 1949, the policy planning staff expanded this idea in the very first comprehensive U.S. policy paper towards Southeast Asia. It was submitted to the National Security Council in the spring of 1949 and argued that the Soviets had been successfully blocked by the Marshall Plan in Western Europe. And Stalin, accordingly, had turned his attention to Asia. Stalin had launched what the policy planning staff called a coordinated offensive in Southeast Asia, designed to divide the world along a north-south axis by denying Southeast Asian mineral wealth to Western Europe and Japan. Southeast Asia, the policy planning staff said, was the vital segment in the Great Crescent of containment that ran through Japan, island Southeast Asia, to India and Pakistan. And to counter this Soviet threat, the U.S. must ease the European colonial powers out of Southeast Asia and work through a screen of anti-communist Asiatics to ensure triumph over red imperialism. Finally, America must develop the economic links between Southeast Asia and Japan. In this global division, Southeast Asia's major function, according to the policy planning staff, was to become a source of raw materials and markets for Japan and secondarily Western Europe. This became something of a mantra, a belief spoken within the halls of the American government over the next decade. For example, at a State Department meeting in October of 1949 to discuss the impact of the communist victory in China, virtually all American diplomats agreed that China posed little military threat to the rest of Asia. But, as George Kennan observed, the creation of the People's Republic posed a terrific problem for Japan. With China lost, Kennan said, Japan would become a hostage unless they again reopened some sort of empire to the south. A colleague agreed. It was America's responsibility henceforth to get Japan back into, I am afraid, he said, the old co-prosperity sphere. By the end of 1949 and early 1950, American diplomats and journalists, in private as well as public, began talking about a U.S.-Soviet competition to forge a new kind of co-prosperity sphere. Defense Department planners warned that unless the U.S. moved quickly, Moscow would integrate Japan, Manchuria, and Korea into a northern communist co-prosperity sphere. The Soviets would then subdue Japan easily by denying access to Southeast Asia or forcing its dependence on China. According to one set of CIA analyses, a Soviet-controlled Japan would add an astounding 25% to the Kremlin's industrial military power. American journalists wrote about this. This wasn't just within the private halls of government. American journalists Joseph and Stuart Alsop went through the region of Southeast Asia in 1950, and in a series of articles in Newsweek and in the Washington Post, announced they had discovered a communist plot to create a communist co-prosperity sphere, much larger than that envisioned by Japan's wartime imperialists. They unveiled what they called the bowling pin theory, an early version of what became the domino theory. They warned that the head pin, China, was already knocked down. The next two pins, Burma and French Indochina, were teetering. If they fell, the three pins in the third row, Siam, Thailand, Malaya, and Indonesia, were sure to topple next. The resulting psychological, political, and economic magnetism would almost certainly drag down the four pins in the fourth row, India, Pakistan, Japan, and the Philippines. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 superseded all talk of bowling pins. By then, Dulles had narrowed the gap among American civilian and military agencies regarding a Japanese peace treaty. Prime Minister Yoshida eased the path towards an American settlement by promising personally and through aides he sent to Washington that Japan would accept some level of post-occupation American base rights in Japan. But in return for their consenting to peace and security treaties, which were likely to antagonize the Soviet Union and China, Japanese officials wanted assurances from their American counterparts. The United States would not, in the words of the Japanese emissaries, write off Taiwan, South Korea, and Indochina, areas which they considered parts of Japan's critical outlying security zone. This message resonated in Washington, with top officials like Dulles and others urging Truman before the outbreak of the Korean War to commit to defending Taiwan, South Korea, and Indochina, all steps the U.S. did take after the outbreak of the Korean War. In some ways, American officials were more divided than their Japanese counterparts about the security dimensions of a peace settlement. Dulles continually feared that the Joint Chiefs' obsession with base rights risked what he said over-militarizing the relationship between the U.S. and Japan. Dulles complained at one point that getting American colonels out of their Japanese villas would be the most impressive military victory in Japan since the Pearl Harbor attack. He also complained that the American military's insistence on retaining legal control over U.S. personnel stationed in Japan was like the unequal extraterritorial treaties imposed on China in the 19th century. Pentagon pressure forced Dulles to push the Japanese government to accept more extensive base rights than Prime Minister Yoshida hoped for, and to agree in principle on organizing a small military despite constitutional prohibitions. But Dulles always said that securing Japanese goodwill and prosperity were far more valuable than additional U.S. military bases. And this, in turn, required protecting Southeast Asia. Just weeks after the North Korean attack on South Korea, in a public address, Dulles described what he said the communist offensive in Korea was really aimed at getting control over Japan. If South Korea fell, Japan would have fallen without an open struggle, Dulles predicted. However, at the same time, if progress towards a peace treaty stalled because of over-involvement in Korea, we may lose in Japan more than we gain in South Korea. The fighting in Korea, of course, had a tremendous impact on Japan in many ways, especially economically. The surge in U.S. military procurements, which actually surpassed occupation-era recovery aid, coincided with a concerted Japanese export promotion to the United States. Dulles continued to push for a Japanese peace treaty throughout the fighting in Korea in 1950 and 51. During his previously mentioned February 1951 meeting in Tokyo, Dulles and Yoshida initialed 5 documents that became the template for later settlements. These included an outline of the peace treaty, a draft collective security agreement, permission for U.S. forces to utilize Japan in combat operations in Korea, a list of facilities Japan would supply to American forces after the occupation, and an outline of a status of forces agreement governing troops in post-occupation Japan. Yoshida agreed that American forces could be deployed anywhere in the Far East and could even be used to suppress internal disorder. The Security Pact obligated Japan to assume increasing responsibility for its own defense, but at the same time did not require the U.S. to defend Japan. MacArthur's firing in April of 1951, had surprisingly little impact on the peace process. By August of 1951, the battle lines in Korea had stabilized. The war would drag on for 2 more years, but the battle lines had largely stabilized. Dulles persuaded Truman and Secretary of State Acheson to invite 50 countries to attend the peace conference in San Francisco. This proved essentially a ceremonial event, as the treaty was presented on a take-it-or-leave-it basis with no amendments allowed. The 2 most contentious issues before, during, and after the peace conference related to China and military base rights. The British were especially concerned Because of the status of Hong Kong and its vulnerability, and the prospect of renewed Japanese trade competition in Southeast Asia, the British were especially concerned with Dulles' effort to bar Japan from trade or political relations with the People's Republic of China. In a discussion with Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his deputy Anthony Eden, Churchill suggested that the United States go easy on Japan and allow it, if it wished, to increase trade with China. Dulles snapped back that it was simply inconceivable that Washington would ever permit Japan to pursue foreign policies that cut across the interests of the United States. Meanwhile, the Joint Chiefs of Staff continued to expand their demands for post-occupation base rights. To smooth over these issues, neither China nor Taiwan were invited to the peace conference, and Dulles shifted all discussion of security issues to a separate bilateral U.S.-Japan security treaty outside the peace treaty. When Prime Minister Yoshida proposed delivering a speech at the peace conference that only gently hinted at some areas of disagreement with Washington, Secretary of State Acheson vetoed the text and instead had an American diplomat ghostwrite a speech for the Prime Minister. Getting Congress to approve the peace and security treaties proved somewhat more complicated than Americans had anticipated. The treaties were signed in September of 1951, but Congress didn't act until the spring of 1952 to actually approve the treaties. Secretary of State Acheson and Dulles had to testify in secret before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, explaining the importance of both treaties. The United States, they said, required a friendly Japan just as much as Japan required a friendly United States. Soviet leaders, they warned, were determined to exploit the industrial capacity of Japan. If the Kremlin gained control of either Germany or Japan, they warned, the stage would be set for a climactic struggle of doubtful outcome. These arguments prevailed, although the Senate delayed ratifying both the peace and security treaties until March of 1952, and it acted only when Tokyo surrendered legal jurisdiction over U.S. military personnel, accepted strict limits on trade with China, and pledged to sign a peace settlement exclusively with Taiwan, not the People's Republic. Despite the achievements at San Francisco, the erosion of French military position in Indochina continued to trouble Washington. During the summer of 1952, the National Security Council analyzed the impact of a French defeat in Indochina. The National Security Council predicted that Japan's access to raw materials and markets for exports would in the future determine its level of actual cooperation with the United States. Because of this, the loss of Indochina would almost inevitably force Japan into an accommodation with the communist-controlled regions of Asia. It would probably lead to a swift submission to an alignment with communism. Unfortunately, the NSC reported, the American public seemed largely indifferent to the struggle against communism in Indochina, and it urged the administration, the Truman administration, to make efforts to prepare the American public for more direct American intervention. In May of 1952, as he prepared to leave the State Department, soon to be named Eisenhower's Secretary of State, Dulles gave a speech in Paris describing the importance of Southeast Asia, a speech in Paris to Japanese officials. It was vital, he said, to hold the line in Korea and Indochina to contain Communist China. But he told French officials the ultimate importance of holding Indochina had nothing to do with French glory. Rather, he described Indochina as the key to Southeast Asia upon which Japan's future is largely dependent. In the first week of the new Eisenhower administration in 1953, now Secretary of State Dulles delivered a radio address in which he argued the Soviets were making a drive to get Japan, not only through Korea, but for what they're doing in Indochina. The loss of the rice bowl of Asia, he said, would jeopardize Japan's survival as an American ally. Would lead to the loss of Southeast Asia, would lead to the loss of Japan. From the moment the communists took French Indochina, Dulles predicted, and these were his words, the Japs would be thinking, how do we get to the other side? The Joint Chiefs agreed with this and said the loss of Southeast Asia would place such great economic and political strain on Japan as Japan would move towards an accommodation with communism. These concerns motivated much of the Eisenhower administration's boost of military aid to the French in 1953 and 1954, and explains why, when the French were faced with defeats in the spring of 1954, the U.S. became so concerned. The Joint Chiefs warned Eisenhower that a Viet Minh victory over the French would impress Asians as a communist victory. Inevitably, Japan, the keystone of American power in the Far East, would be forced into an accommodation with the communist bloc. Dulles told the entire cabinet that a red victory in Indochina would cut our defense line in half. Stopping communism in Indochina, Dulles told journalists, was of transcendent importance. In April, the French garrison in Dien Bien Phu was on the brink of defeat, and Eisenhower made an unusual personal appeal to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. He called for some form of united action to save the French. The loss of Indochina, Eisenhower told Churchill, would put such pressure on Japan, it would be impossible to prevent Tokyo from reaching an accommodation with the communist world. A failure to act, Eisenhower said, would be as great a mistake as that made by the Western democracies in the 1930s in their failure to halt Hirohito, Mussolini, and Hitler by not acting in time. The president said much the same thing in a public statement. He declared the U.S. simply can't afford to lose Indochina. A French defeat would lead to the loss of all Southeast Asia, which would go over quickly like a row of dominoes. Japan, the ultimate domino, would have no choice but to gravitate, Eisenhower said, towards the communist area in order to live. The loss would be incalculable to the free world. Congressional leaders and the British, of course, declined to intervene. But in spite of these warnings, the Geneva Accords, the peace conference in Geneva in the spring of 1954, resulted in a French decision to disengage from French Indochina. The Americans were disappointed in some ways, but Dulles actually was quite, as he said, pleased at the relatively moderate terms accepted by the communists at Geneva, given their military strength on the ground. And he hoped to encourage anti-communist forces by taking advantage of the temporary North-South division of Vietnam. The United States, Dulles signaled, would go along with the Geneva Accords if the British and French agreed to support an American effort to form a Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. All his concerns, Dulles made clear, related to Japan, which he said was the soul of the Far East. Without access to Southeast Asia, Japan would slip away, and without Japan as an ally, the U.S. position in Asia would become untenable. To prevent this, Dulles and Eisenhower planned to rally anti-communist forces in southern Vietnam. And above all, they said, avoid having all Vietnam elections since the communists would likely win. Of course, in the fall of 1954, Dulles organized the Manila Conference, which produced the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Only 2 Asian nations participated, the Philippines and Thailand, but at Dulles' insistence, SEATO included a clause saying that SEATO members had an interest in the security of the non-communist part of southern Vietnam, then just emerging. Throughout the remainder of the 1950s and early 60s, Japanese and American officials squabbled over the levels and pace of rearmament. The U.S. wanted more, faster. The Japanese, less, slower. How to manage Japan's desire to increase trade with communist China. Japan wanted more, the U.S. less. President Eisenhower proved surprisingly adept in smoothing over many of the issues between the U.S. and Japan. He encouraged greater Japanese exports to the United States, despite protests from American manufacturers. He listened sympathetically to Japanese requests for relaxing the embargo on trade with China. And he even agreed finally, of course, to renegotiate the 1951 Security Treaty. Some American Cold Warriors still argued that Eisenhower wasn't doing enough. And yet, Eisenhower believed dearly that Japan was the heart and soul of American security in Asia. And in one of Eisenhower's last speeches on the subject of Japan and Southeast Asia, given at Gettysburg College in 1959, a speech circulated very widely in the Japanese government, Eisenhower stressed the link between future American security, the Japanese economy, and the survival of South Vietnam. This was 1959. America, he explained, must increase aid to South Vietnam to prevent the crumbling of the entire barrier to communism in Southeast Asia. This mattered because Japan, the essential counterweight to communism in Asia, needed Southeast Asia's trade to live. Strengthening Vietnam and Southeast Asia, Eisenhower declared, ensured Japan's survival as an ally. Abandoning Vietnam or restricting Japanese trade with the U.S., Eisenhower warned, would risk the free world's stake in the whole Pacific. To just conclude with an anecdote, less than a month after Japan's formal surrender to the Allied powers in September of 1945, a junior American diplomat, John Emerson, moved into his Tokyo office just requisitioned from the Mitsui Corporation. As he arrived in the office in downtown Tokyo, the Mitsui junior executive was clearing out the last remnants from his desk. The Mitsui executive pointed to a map on his wall depicting Japan's co-prosperity sphere. "There it is," he remarked. "We tried. See what you can do with it." At that moment, Emerson later recalled, the whole burden of American foreign policy in Asia hit me in the stomach. What were we going to do with it? In a sense, that question haunted U.S. policymakers for much of the next 30 years, perhaps even longer. 6 years after Emerson's encounter, the 1951 peace treaty ushered in an era of Japanese progress as a democratic, peaceful, prosperous nation. The generous peace treaty and concurrent economic growth secured Japan's reemergence as a great economic power, as well as a committed American ally. But the treaty and its American authors always conceived of it as merely one element of a comprehensive regional security framework with concentric rings that facilitated Japan's prosperity, but at the same time ensnared the United States into the later cauldron of Vietnam. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。それでは
Thank you very much. So, we'd like to move on to the first part 1, the path to San Francisco Peace Treaty. So the panelists, and please come onto the stage.
The moderator for this session is Professor Yuichi Hosoya of Keio University. I hand over to you, Professor Hosoya. Thank you for the introduction. I am Hosoya. I am with Keio University. In this session, based on the recent research, based on primary source historical materials that have been made newly available in Japan, Europe, and the United States, we are going to add perspectives, various perspectives, to the analysis of the San Francisco Peace Treaty. First speaker, is Professor Sumio Hatano of Japan Center for Asia Historical Records to give a keynote speech for about 20 minutes. And the panel discussion will follow with Professor Kazuya Sakamoto, Professor of Osaka University, and Professor Ayako KUSUNOKI, Associate Professor of International Research Center for Japanese Studies, and the Professor MIYASHITA of Hosei University. And after that, I want to ask Professor Michael SCHALLER to comment. Now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Professor Hatano, please.
Thank you for your introduction. I'm Hatano. In this symposium, I was asked to speak to you, and I am also serving as the head of the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records. This center, as you know, has documents from the early Meiji to the World War II. The public documents, historical public documents are digitized, and we disclose to the public, and we have been involved in such a project. It has marked 17 years as well as some months. Up until 1945, there are documents available through that time, and those documents are almost all disclosed. And starting from last year, after the post-war era materials have been started to be disclosed, particularly those are related to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs documents and materials. So that is the first phase. In 1972, up until the joint declaration between China and Japan, those documents up until then will be disclosed, mostly related to the Asian documents, and we're working on it. Right now, from the occupation to the peace treaty period is covered, which covers various events during the occupation, and revision of the Constitution, as well as the topic which is a point of talk of today, which is the peace treaty. So, I think we have all those materials that are fit for the theme of this symposium. So, I'd like you to utilize the materials available from the Japan Center for Asian Historical Records as well. Today, the outline has been distributed to you, but I'm not going to cover everything. As I mentioned under the introduction, San Francisco Peace Treaty has undergone the transition from the Versailles peace system to the Cold War peace system. From the punitive peace to a Cold War type. So that is a peace under the guidance of the United States. So the contents have been mitigated over time. That's what I'm referring to. When it comes to peace, refers to a state in which the victorious and defeated nations restore stability to their relationship by resolving a variety of issues resulting from the war that they fought. To restore a stable relationship, if that is the case, then under the Cold War, this peace system that was established during the Cold War, the peace system is mentioned in the footnotes as well a little bit. It's not just merely referring to the peace treaty. That is a starting point. So there are peace treaties with the South Korea and other Southeast Asian countries, as well as reparation agreements, and the joint declaration with between Japan and Soviet in 1956, and 96 a basic treaty with the South Korea, and reparation agreement with the South Korea, as well as a joint declaration of Japan and China in 1972. So it covers all those things. At any rate, this peace system was established as the new, peace treaty in 1952. And this one, the members who are gathered here on the stage have been engaged in this side of the research. And so this is the combined with the Japan-U.S. security treaty as well. So the international security is also related to this one, and the Asia and the Pacific international order stability, as well as internal order stability is also factored in. in establishing this type of peace system. So the disposal of various issues in the post-war has been a little bit distanced in that sense. So unsettled issues in that sense have remained, such as territorial issues, though I'm not going to touch upon that, or reparation issue has remained. Another thing that I want to mention is that the de facto peace is quite often talked about. Up until peace system, it took 6 to 7 years. In the case of treaty with Italy, it took 2 years. So, however, in the case of Japan, it took quite a long time. So, up until then, the international war tribunals were over and the results already available. And in line with the Potsdam Declaration, the occupation policy was very much progressing as well. So the de facto peace was progressing. And finally, ultimately, under the peace treaty, the remaining issues were resolved. And the third point is the renunciation of reparation claims. There are some peace treaties and reparation agreements, and those are, basically reflecting, these claims are reflected in those. There are countries that did not renounce reparation claims, however, through negotiations. 1972, the joint communique between Japan and China. Up until then, there were agreements and treaties that were signed with Asian countries where renunciation and reparation claims were made. There were also some colonized countries in Japan up until then, but these, if we call the colonial regions colonial empire, then Taiwan, Korean Peninsula, and Japan needed to release all those areas. And so the liquidation of the colonial empire and the unification was achieved as the peace system was made. The liquidation of the colonial empire and the peace system are two separate things to begin with, but in this case they were combined, and Japan struggled for that. There were various issues as they tried to combine these two issues. The typical case was South Korea, or ROK. There's a Treaty of Basic Acts that was signed in 1965, but it took 14 years, which is related to the issue of liquidation of the colonial empire and the unification. At any rate, in 1951, starting from this peace system or peace treaty, how the peace system developed since that point on. So I divided that system into 3 different periods. I don't go into detail, however, in a phased manner, I categorize them into 3. As I mentioned, from 1950s to 1970s, the peace treaty system was established, and that was completed with the signing of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Japan and China in 1978. The second is the stabilization and entrenchment of the peace system. That is referring to the 1980s. In the 1980s, there's no overseas issues. However, there are more domestic issues such as Yasukuni Shrine issue. Or as an international issue, there was a school textbook issue. And domestically, the Yasukuni Shrine issue took place. Domestically, the Japanese war victims' compensation issue arose in 1980s. Over those issues, the peace system was indirectly serving as a block not to prevent Japan from incurring some other additional reparations. In the 1990s, there were issues that the peace system did not expect, and that is post-war compensation issues. From the Miyazawa cabinet to Murayama cabinet, during that period, the Cold War was over, and the LDP's rule is a little bit wobbly at the time. And then China and South Korea brought up the issue of the post-war reparations, that is the comfort women or forced labor issues. Those issues were raised to the Japanese side. And outside of this peace system were China and South Korea. So those countries brought up those issues as an issue of individual compensation. So as the government, the Japanese government wants to maintain the peace system's legal framework. They wanted to protect it. So they try to take action from more humanitarian point of view to address those issues. So in early 1990s, this post-war compensation issue means that this peace system was challenged, and the peace system itself became a little bit wobbly. Still, they stopped it from getting worse, I think. For example, Asian Women's Fund is very typical of such actions that were taken by the government. From the humanitarian point of view, the government addressed that issue for the historical issue. And there are some references. Page 2, that is. Post-war compensation came to an end. That is in April 2007, decision by the Supreme Court. What is notable is the Chinese victims, and there were 2 trial cases. Ultimately, the Supreme Court Japan ruled that individuals do not have the right to claim for compensation. The Supreme Court of Japan talked about the framework discussions of the San Francisco peace system. And that is, in 1951, a peace treaty is the starting point. In 1972, the joint declaration with China, as well as the friendship treaty with China, including all those treaties, those are included under the framework of the San Francisco peace system. So what they discussed, and also some of the issues are referred to over here. So that is, whichever the treaty resolves to the reciprocal renunciation of claims, and that is common among all those treaties and agreements. In particular, the peace treaty, San Francisco Peace Treaty, the China and the Soviet Union, which did not participate in the San Francisco Peace Treaty, there's a Japan-Soviet joint declaration, as well as the Sino-Japanese joint declaration. For these ones, they are also placed under the San Francisco Treaty framework. So the legal issues relevant to those are written over here. Under reference, there is number 3 in parentheses. I underlined some sentences. Under this framework, this framework was put in place. This framework is interpreted as having been designed based on the idea that if the resolution of issues related to claims for various wartime matters is left to the ex post exercise of rights by individuals to bring civil proceedings in spite of a peace treaty being in place, which may impose unexpected excessive burdens on both nations and people and cause disruption at the signing of the peace treaty, the attainment of the goal set forth in such a treaty would be hindered. So that's what it says. Not just limited to the Supreme Court ruling, the Japanese government concept or ideas is represented in here as well. So the international order stability should not be challenged, which was established under the San Francisco Peace Treaty. So peace system has left some remaining issues, which I referred to earlier. Getting back to number 2 in my handout. And this is the process for formation of the peace system. What's notable is the making reference to a treaty of peace with Italy. The discussion was held. There was no peace treaty with Germany, so the most immediate one was a treaty of peace with Italy, and that was made reference to. So the Japan side worked on their own. In particular, with regard to colonization issue, this treaty of peace with Italy was made reference to a greater extent. Second is a role by the UK. This is the point that has been long since pointed out. The US opted for generous direction. They came much closer to the Cold War peace system. However, the UK was particular about the war responsibility so that it can be contained in the peace treaty, and they negotiated with the US. That was the role of the UK. The third point, the war responsibility. So I'll touch upon that a little bit. Like I said earlier, the International War Crimes Tribunal is already over, and how it should be incorporated into this peace treaty was one point of discussion. So Article 11 is mentioned in here. The Japan accepts the judgments of the International Military Tribunal for the parties. So that expression was used. So accept the judgments, it says. So it's not the total trial. It accepts the judgments only, and execution of the sentencing only was accepted. So what poses as a question out of that would be 3-2 is referring to that. The war criminals who are imprisoned in Sugamo prison, they were released immediately. And immediately after release, they received some allowance. And those criminals who have been executed are treated as having died in the line of duty. So what is the war criminal? So that question was raised internationally. Second page. So the point is, the International Military Tribunal was already completed. So what is the significance of that, which is different from the Treaty of Peace with Italy? So the significance of International Military Tribunal was not clearly written down. So verification of the past war was able to be averted to some extent by the Japanese government. So the compensation that the government should be responsible for. So who is to be blamed for the war? Who are the real war victims who should receive compensation from the government? So those questions remain. So simply put, the summary of the war was averted. The clause for war responsibility to verify what really happened in the war was prevented. Number 4 is a reparation issue. After World War I, the international diplomacy in relation to war reparations focused on restoring balance to the entire international political economic system and promoting its development. So that was a perspective that was very much emphasized after World War I. So the compensation issue, reparation issue, was to secure international order, that is Asia-Pacific region, or the peace in the Asia-Pacific, as well as developing the regional, those issues are related to ensuring international security, establishing and stabilizing regional order, and reforming politics and the economy in Japan. So those are the differences from the peace treaties after World War I. In the case of Keynes, the economist John Keynes was deeply involved in U.S. and UK effort to devise post-war frame. He said that the victorious nations the defeated nations are able to push for economic development after their demilitarization, free from having to pay for security costs. However, victorious nations often have to bear the costs associated with controlling, demilitarizing the defeated nations under their occupation. So that is not fair. So he came up with the idea of deducting a certain amount of money from the trade income of defeated nations in the name of global peacekeeping expenses through a unique trade settlement system, integrated foreign exchanges. So the former Axis powers are bearing the post-war security costs as well. So that means this security cost is not a temporal one. The post-war reparations are not tentative in nature, but were built into the political and economic order, including in terms of bearing the security costs and setting trade income over the long term. So that was the idea of Keynes. So the Allied powers focused upon the idea of global peacekeeping expenses, that is, the economic security in one sense. By applying that idea, so they departed from the punitive nature of compensation to a more long-term bearing of security expenses. This particular concept, we cannot say that this has been fully leveraged in the reparation policy in the post-war era. However, there is a assistance called Gary Owa. The payment for Gary Owa. These negotiations lasted up until 1962. And the U.S. held that idea, so the long-term security cost should be borne by Japan. That idea must have existed in the U.S. In 1952, in February, Dallas visited the Philippines. And the Philippines he tried to encourage the Philippines to renounce the reparations. The Japan is an island country, so all Japan can do would be to pay repayments, the compensation via trading. But that persuasion did not succeed. But anyway, when I consider that one episode, the Keynes concept seemed to have been very much reflected upon that. Thank you.
Professor Hatano, thank you very much for your keynote presentation. And he is also the chairman of the commission, which is in charge of the documentation of post-war historical materials at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much for your very insightful presentation. Now let's move on to panelists. Professor Sakamoto, Professor Kusunoki, Professor Miyashita. In that order, I would like to receive a presentation from the three members of the panel. Professor Sakamoto, please. I am Sakamoto. I am the Osaka University. After attending the peace conference in San Francisco on the eve of his departure back home, Prime Minister Yoshida hosted a dinner party to appreciate the effort of Foreign Ministry's staff who accompanied him. And he said at the outset, "I have waited 6 years for this day. Now I have at last realized my long-cherished ambition to sign a peace treaty that does no harm to the dignity of Japan." Director General of Treaties Bureau of the Ministry, Mr. Nishimura, who was there and listened to directly, he recalled that he couldn't hold back his tears, understanding the old Prime Minister's feeling. Since he became Prime Minister with fearless remarks that history offers examples of winning a diplomacy after losing in a war, he was filled with a strong mission of bringing the end to Japan's status of defeated state. When he was young, he went to the Paris Peace Conference as a member of the Japanese delegation, and he watched Germany grieve over the imposition of a harsh Treaty of Versailles that might motivate him all the more. And Prime Minister Yoshida, with high self-esteem in his day-to-day contact with General MacArthur and GHQ, worked and behaved as a good loser. And this year marks the 150th Meiji Restoration, in which his grandfather-in-law, Toshimichi Okubo, and biological father played active role. And I think that in this 150 years since the Meiji Restoration, the history of Japan has been one of learning from the West to build a modern state and conflict with the West over regional order in Asia in cooperation with the West to advance the free world. Maybe you would say that is a too broad explanation, but if I am asked to describe 150-year history of Japan with emphasis on Japan's relations with the world's center of gravity, that would be the explanation. The San Francisco Peace Treaty is the cornerstone of international law, which significantly altered the course of post-war Japan from the conflict with the West to cooperation with the West. With a successful transition like this brought to Japan security and prosperity far greater than its pre-war period. Also, by successfully changing Japan's post-war course, the U.S. and the free world was able to win the Cold War. Partially, the treaty is an agreement among states, and for a treaty like this to be successful, both parties have to be satisfied with the agreement, particularly when it comes to past-war settlement treaty. The defeated parties, namely the party that is forced to concede in many ways, needs to be satisfied. Otherwise, the treaty will not be successful in the short run or the long run. In this sense, San Francisco Peace Treaty, 30 years before that, there was a lesson to be learned from the Treaty of Versailles because of the harsh imposition of the terms. Having said that, San Francisco Peace Treaty could be compared with a peace treaty between Italy and the Allied powers as well. Compared to that treaty, it was quite generous to the defeated. So Prime Minister Yoshida said this is a fair and generous treaty. And Special Ambassador John Foster Dulles, who negotiated on behalf of the Allied powers, said that this is a treaty of reconciliation and trust. And at the time of the signing of the Treaty of San Francisco, Professor Kisaburo Yokota, who was teaching international law at the University of Tokyo, said that this is a fair and generous treaty worthy of the phrase of reconciliation and trust in 5 meanings. As you can see in my handout, first of all, nothing is said about responsibility for the war. And perhaps Professor Yokosa do not know, but drafting stage by the United States and the United Kingdom, learning from the Italian peace treaty, there was an idea to put war responsibility in the preamble. This was the British idea. However, Yoshida Japanese government was able to learn this British idea from the U.S. side in strict confidence, and it was strictly opposed and aborted. And the Article 11 of the peace treaty provides for the treatment of detained war criminals. And in this clause, Japan accepts the judgments of the Tokyo Tribunal. And therefore, with this phrase, Article 11, according to some, is to acknowledge Japan's aggression caused the war, or holding A-class war criminals responsible for the war. However, this interpretation is outrageous because the US and UK who drafted the treaty didn't have such an intention, and Japan also didn't consider that way. If this clause would be of great importance like this, it should have been more contentious. And the also Treaty of Peace between Japan and Republic of China, which was signed in the same year, should have the same provision. And secondly, there is no restrictions on rearmament, unlike the treaty with Italy. And Professor Yokota also said that no formal obligation regarding guarantees for human rights gives a generosity. And the reparations were reduced to maintain a viable economy and could be repaid in the form of services. And sometimes this is mentioned as the generosity of this treaty, and like Professor Yokota as well. However, that is only compared to the Treaty of Versailles, which attempted to take exorbitant amount from Germany. But in this treaty, Japan lost about 45% of its territory, and also all overseas assets were taken by victorious countries and even by neutral states. It's not a small amount. Therefore, it isn't that Japan obtained a settlement at the bargain price. Prime Minister Yoshida actually, in the acceptance speech, complained about northern territories and repatriates, and also he complained confiscation of assets issue. Another point, and I think this is typical reference by international law scholar, but ratification by majority of 48 allied powers in Japan was not the basis for peace treaty. And this treaty required the ratification of Japan, which is a defeated country. Therefore, the agreement between victorious and defeated states, that form is clearly mentioned as equal states. And Professor Yokota said that this is a generous agreement and acceptable by Japan. And Yokota mentioned two reasons for this. One is the passage of time. The other is Cold War. In my report, I would like to amplify these two reasons, but at the same time, I would like to add another reason, which is not mentioned by Professor Yokota, which is a major reason. First, with regard to passage of time, let me amplify that. The peace treaty was signed 6 years after the end of the war. According to my handout, Yokota said that because of the passage of time, the pain, hostility, and desire for vengeance was appeased, and that gave a generosity to the treaty. That is true. However, when we talk about the passage of time, naturally occurring emotional change with the passage of time would not explain fully the generosity during 6 years. More importantly, various reforms took place based on Potsdam Declaration. And Yokota says freedom of rearmament and no restriction on rearmament and no formal obligation for human rights guarantee were not necessary because the non-militarization and democratization made advancement based on the Potsdam Declaration. And so in this way, in the midst of the So we must admit that the key to the occupation-led reform, namely amendment of the Constitution of the Empire of Japan or new Constitution of Japan, played an important role in making the peace treaty fair and generous. Because of the Article 9 denunciation of war potentials was necessary. Some people say that Article 9 is exorbitant. However, which was better, limiting armament in an international treaty or being forced to write in the Constitution, which is a domestic law, that we renounce war potential, which was clearly the latter case created less problem because it is easier to change the Constitution because it's a domestic law. Actually, only 2 years after the peaceful independence, Japan, despite the constitution that prohibits possession of ground, marine, and air forces, created self-defense forces based on the constitutional interpretation that we could own minimum level of defense needed for that nation. So currently, 3 services of SDFs have grown into world-leading military organization with the annual budget exceeding 5 trillion yen. So it's like a politically correct expression, like we can sometimes call sake, hanyato, a jargon among Buddhist monks. So setting aside its harmful effect, there was a huge debate over the interpretation of the Constitution. But to protect, debate on defense had the aspect as if it were more important to protect the existence of SDF constitutionally than how SDFs should defend the nation. However, it was only domestic debate. It's daunting to just imagine that debate had to engage all 48 countries. And another reason for generosity, according to Yokota, is U.S.-Soviet Cold War. And U.S. wanted to be friendly to Japan, welcoming Japan to the member of the West, and reconciliation was conceived in line with this policy, and that made the treaty more favorable and generous. And it is true, but there is no mentioning of Korean War in his article, because it was in the midst of Korean War that San Francisco Treaty was concluded and entered into force, and also Yokota wrote this article during the Korean War, and although we are separated by the water, but it was a very hot war, but there was no mention of Korean War. Korean War is a part of Cold War, but however, this is nothing but hot war, and this hot war proved strategic value of Japan in the eyes of the U.S. government. Without Japan, the U.S. and United Nations forces were not able to establish even a bridgehead, and Dallas admitted to a British diplomat, according to a document, that with the outbreak of the Korean War, Japan gained a stronger bargaining power. And also, China, which was labeled as aggressor by the United Nations General Assembly, was not invited to the San Francisco Peace Conference. And also, Republic of China, which was not invited to the conference due to the necessity of opposing the PRC, Taiwan cooperated with the U.S. policy of protecting and nurturing Japan, which had become more important with the war in Korea, and had no choice but to respond with generous reconciliation with Japan and peace treaty with Japan. Therefore, it is not just because the U.S. wanted to keep Japan on its side, but also because of the hot war like Korean War, China, which suffered most from the war with Japan, had become a U.S. enemy. That is why the generosity nature was facilitated in the peace treaty. The passage of time, Cold War, and these 2 reasons mentioned by Professor Kisaburo Yokota, I just amplified these reasons. But there is another important reason which was not explained by Yokota. That is a Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, former Security Treaty, which was signed at the same time as peace treaty. The U.S. in signing the peace treaty, not just for the security of Japan, but more importantly, for peace and security of the Far East broadly, the U.S. wanted to have many military bases for the U.S. forces, and they wanted to directly write a provision for stationing the U.S. forces in Japan in the pre-peace treaty. However, it was strongly opposed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, it's worded, it would appear that U.S. forces are stationed to keep tabs on Japan or monitor the implementation of the peace treaty, thus hugely degrade Japan as a sovereign state. So it shouldn't be written in the peace treaty. It should be separated. So that was a string intention assertion by Japan. Fortunately, the UK also thought it should be separated as well. And also, government of Japan voluntarily presented a draft treaty to the United States. Then the US said the security treaty can be separated from the peace treaty. And the peace treaty was designed as Japan wanted. However, the issue is US-Japan security treaty, which Japan requested to be separated. Government of Japan wanted to be equal partners, Japan and the U.S. after the settlement. And we would like Japan want to have the form that there is a security cooperation. So Japan's security is a Pacific security. Pacific security is the U.S. security. That's why Japan would give the U.S. access to bases. In return, the U.S. defends Japan. So this is a 50-50, and this is an equal partner relationship and cooperation. However, to this, the U.S. attitude is such that Japan does not even have means to defend itself. Then why is it that Japan can sign an equal partner treaty of security with the United States? What are you saying? That was the kind of attitude. And actually, the security treaty, because Japan wants the U.S. station its forces in Japan. So that was the kind of unilateral security, and no expiry date was set, no obligation for the U.S. to defend Japan, and under the attached SOFA gives various privileges to the U.S. forces. So Mr. Nishimura, Director General of Treaty Bureau, later lamented that despite grueling effort, this has become a very much like an agreement for stationing the U.S. forces. And I think the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was the kind of price we had to pay for the generous and fair peace treaty. And this security treaty is an unequal treaty, so therefore we have to think about both treaties as a package. It is true, like Yoshida said, peace treaty is a fair and generous. However, it is fair to say that San Francisco Peace Treaty was not a treaty of reconciliation and trust that would quickly create relationship between equal partners. Japan and the U.S. formally have become equal partners only when at least 1960 amendment of Security Pact and 1972 reversion of Okinawa to Japanese administration. In fact, I think we are equal partners, but there are some people deny that. So in any case, Japan-U.S. security cooperation on an equal partner basis, I think this was the top priority for Japan in the post-war Japan, in order to promote and advance free world after the World War II. My question today, why peace treaty was fair and generous? I mentioned important three reasons, namely change in East Asian political landscape caused by the Korean War that broke out against the backdrop of Cold War, and in addition to that, Constitution of Japan and Security Pact have to be mentioned. These three laws, I often say that, are the basic laws of Trinity that define the framework for post-war Japan. And my main research theme has been historical structure of this Trinity and its development in changing international environment. Today, I asked why peace treaty was fair and generosity, and I hope that I gave you some understanding about that Trinity that I mentioned earlier. Thank you very much.
Professor, thank you very much. Thanks for your very broad-based views. And then Professor Kusunoki, over to you. My name is KUSUNOKI of the International Research Center for Japanese Studies. Thank you very much for inviting me today. Japan's decision toward the establishment of the peace treaty with the Japan and Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, and I was invited and requested to talk about Prime Minister Yoshida's decision in particular. Since time being limited, so my talk on the peace treaty is going to be general, and my talk is going to focus more on the security treaty or the security-related matters, and I would like to follow the resume. Now, with regard to the decision made by Prime Minister Yoshida, if I may just to summarize it, I think the decision focused on majority peace, and his focus was also placed on the format and the framework of security for the post-war Japan. The first one was to provide the basis to the U.S. forces, and when it comes into Japan's rearmament, he was not that active, and he used the term so-called gradual rearmament. So he selected one way of how Japan's security policy should go. With regard to providing basis to the U.S., I think it was that's the idea of majority peace was confirmed around spring of 1950. I would like to take time to dig somewhat deeper into this area. The first one is the peace debate. Overall peace, the majority peace was selected by Prime Minister Yoshida. Around 1949 and through 1950, within Japan, the United States started to think about peace treaty with Japan, and around the time, inside Japan, what should be the format of a peace to be established, and what should be the direction of Japan as the nation after the peace treaty. And there was such a very hot debate over this topic, and a lot of intelligentsia or intellectuals, and in terms of a political area, political parties, the Socialist Party was in favor of a peace with all warring nations. When the world was faced with Cold War, Japan should select a path to build peace with all warring nations. That was their argument. And it was a big voice in the public domain. And in particular, this idea came from the ideal of the pacifist constitution. In accordance with Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan, Japan should not be sided with one side. By doing so, there's going to be a warring state may remain with particular nations, and that kind of selection will go against the spirit of the Constitution. Therefore, neutrality should be the option, and Japan should be dependent on the collective security provided by the United Nations, and at the same time, no military bases should be stationed in Japan. In addition to that, around the Korean War, those forces started to go against any kind of rearmament. And the so-called four principles of peace, they were the mantra of their argument. The so-called this peace study group that was made up of intellectuals at the time was established, and this group was engaged in active argument, and in opposing the idea of majority peace, their argument went like this. By strengthening ties with the West would automatically mean that just entering in peace with some of those Western countries. But by doing so, Japan itself would add fuel to the confrontation in the Cold War. And that kind of approach will go against the spirit of the Constitution. And another argument is more pragmatic. I think Dr. SCHALLER was talking about the economic relations with China. And by depending on the United States and through the so-called majority peace, that would ruin economic independence. And the loss of economic independence will also mean the loss of political independence. And Japan would end up in being dependent on the United States. On the flip side, without the Chinese market, Japan would not be able to survive. And I think that was also another line of argument. So these are the lines of argument, and they expressed. And the Peace Study Group and their intellectuals were quite active in this kind of argument. Meanwhile, the conservative parties, including Prime Minister Yoshida, were also were in favor of overall peace, but in the realistic world, that was a difficult option. And in order to maintain the sense of independence from the occupation, it is the best to get out of the occupation, and the Japanese people should not get used to this kind of situation of occupation. Therefore, majority peace would not be the best option, but a better option in the realistic world. And as for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, weighed the benefits and the disadvantages of going the majority peace. There was a lot of argument made by the ministry around that time, and from the economic point of view, majority peace would be more beneficial. And in the case of a majority peace, there is a warring state that would remain with the United States from the legalistic point of view. That was another point. And the relationship with China and the relationship with Article 9 of the Constitution. Now, they discussed all those elements, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was kind of a loss in failing to make the final decision on which way should go forward. However, in reality, I think the majority peace was the only option available to Japan at the time, especially after the launch of the Korean War. It was a sheer impossibility for Japan to select overall peace. However, it was a very difficult decision still for the Japanese government to go ahead with the majority peace. Now, the second point, I would like to mention two simple things on the subject of security. The first one is one of the important points of Mr. Yoshida's decision. Now, in the case of majority peace, that would automatically mean Japan would be dependent on the security provided by the United States. So within the framework of the security provided by Japan, Prime Minister Yoshida decided to provide bases to the U.S. forces. That means neutrality would not be maintained. The United Nations did not function properly, and so collective security by the United Nations would be no more viable. That means Japan was no choice but relying on the strong power, that namely the United States. So Japan was only available with one single option to rely on security provided by Japan. And within this limited situation, he chose to allow U.S. forces to be stationed in Japan. So providing bases to U.S. forces was not something that Japan was forced to do. More proactively, Japan selected that option, I should say. At the same time, there was also elements that forced Japan to accept the bases, U.S. bases. And this is the second bulleted point. That is, the U.S. military was demanding that U.S. bases should be maintained even after the occupation was over. And the U.S. military was really strong in this argument. And in order to realize peace with the United States and other countries, there was only option available for the government and to provide bases. And Professor Sakamoto was talking about Okinawa and Ogasawara Islands. Unless the bases were provided to the United States, Ogasawara and Okinawa would not be returned to Japan forever. And in this light, Japan had no option other than providing bases. So in return or in exchange for peace, this was the cost that it had to pay. But at the same time, Japan was proactive in offering this kind of cost. Now, with regard to provision of bases, whoever was in the prime ministership, so far as the government was conservative, Mr. Ashida or Mr. Hatoyama, they were purged of the civil services. But even if they had been in the prime ministership, they would have done the same thing. But unique to Mr. Yoshida was the following point: attitude toward rearmament. Prime Minister Yoshida's the option was that no military rearmament before the occupation was over. He was against the idea of eternal non-rearmament. His idea was in the future it would be possible, not for the time being. In his memoir or in the records that were maintained by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and there were some documents with regard to the policy decision-making in 1950, 1951. Now, in those documents, I pointed out 5 points. I think what was most important for Mr. Yoshida were twofold. The first one is economic recovery. Economic recovery should be prioritized. That was the biggest reason for Mr. Yoshida. With the progression of rearmament, that would add more burden to the economic recovery efforts. And I think that was the biggest reason. And the second one was how to view communism, the perception of communism. Mr. Yoshida was worried about the communist forces led by the Soviet Union. But he was not much concerned about the military threat. So I think that was a kind of a difference of nuances between the United States and the Prime Minister Yoshida at that time. He, instead of being worried about the military threat, rather political threat, he highlighted. To be more specific, when the domestic economy was unstable, the social unrest would rise up, and that would allow the infiltration of the communist forces. So, from inside instead of from outside, the society may collapse and degrade into communism, and that was the biggest concern he had. And so the stability of politics, or political, economic, and social stability, would be the biggest hindrance against the infiltration of communism. And so it is not only the military force, and that would give protection for the people. Therefore, healthy nation building would be was one of the important tasks for the government. Therefore, in that kind of situation, the Japanese economy was still very fragile. His priority, therefore, was promoting economic recovery, not putting more emphasis on the military build-up. So that option was something that he wanted to put in the back seat. I think that was another important reason. And another reason, if I may add, is that he mentioned three reasons to the people as well as to the United States. The first one is anti-military feeling in the population. Prime Minister Yoshida was not in good terms with the old military officers, in particular the army, and he was afraid that the re-emergence of military and the people in the government. And with the aggressive rearmament, he also was concerned that the neighboring countries were going to be concerned, and that would have some negative impact on the establishment of peace treaty system. Therefore, with those reasons, Prime Minister Yoshida decided not to go ahead with the rearmament in a quick way. As a result, this policy was adopted officially by the Japanese government, and with that attitude, Japan entered negotiation with the United States. In particular, with regard to rearmament, there were some people inside the Socialist Party that were in favor of rearmament. But the majority of those people in the conservative camp were in favor of a quick rearmament. Therefore, the Prime Minister Yoshida decided to take a different path, balancing those two different forces. And then please refer to the next page. That is about interpreting Yoshida's decision, and 3 points are going to be emphasized here. And first, now, ultimately, the San Francisco Peace Treaty was based on so-called majority peace, and there was a backlash or the negative impacts that we have to admit at the same time. I think that would be discussed in the second part of today's symposium on the topic of relations with Asian countries. As the Professor Sakamoto and Professor Hatano mentioned, there was an issue of war reparations and war responsibility. And if Prime Minister Yoshida had adopted overall peace, what would have happened? I think it would be interesting for us to have that kind of a thought exercise. What would have happened in such a case? The United States definitely rejected it, and during the time of the Korean War, it was impossible for Japan to argue in favor of overall peace. And if the overall peace was not, the peace treaty was failed to be reached, there would be the gradual relaxation of occupation management. Occupation management was going to be relaxed gradually, and the sovereignty accordingly was returned gradually to Japan, similar to the case of Germany. That said, what it would mean to Japan, that was a separate story. But there is one difference, a distinction from West Germany, that Japan, it would mean a very serious matter because of the relationship with the Soviet Union. And the second one is base and military construction. Now, how do we see Yoshida's choice? And the previous speaker was talking about the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty. Yoshida's choice was no immediate rearmament, and as a result, that ended in asymmetry of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. Japan was obligated to provide bases to the United States, while the United States was not obligated to provide to defend Japan. So there was no mutuality in terms of the text of the Security Treaty, and Americans' position was accepted by Japan, and that resulted in the asymmetry of the U.S. and Japan Security Treaty. Needless to say, there was a huge difference in terms of the strength between the two countries. Therefore, anything that comes out of the negotiation would include asymmetric elements, but because of the option taken by Prime Minister Yoshida, I think it added more asymmetry. The United States, at the end of the day, was stick to the Japanese territory, and that I think we probably that Prime Minister Yoshida was not very much concerned about the specific words, but those texts were not very productive. I mean, not good enough because of the asymmetry of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty, and it would may ruin or undermine the legitimacy of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. That was another point. And in addition to that, the peace treaty and the U.S. and Japan security treaty, if you're going to read those texts, Japan would gradually construct the defense and forces, including accepting the right of collective defense and relying on the U.S. And so if you take a look at the overall structure of those two treaties, the U.S. forces were allowed to stay in Japan, in the Japanese territory, and it was supposed to be considered, if you read the text, that it was supposed to be a temporary measure until rearmament was complete. That means the U.S. forces would stay in the Japanese territory, but it was a temporary measure until Japan completed the rearmament. I think Mr. Yoshida tended to explain the reason to the Japanese people in that way, and I think the official explanation was also made similarly by the United States. Not only Japan's defense of Japan, but also for the protecting the stability of the Far East. But this kind of a part was not clearly defined. What was more important for the United States at the time, the U.S. forces were stationed in Japan for the purpose of protecting the security of the United States, of the Asia Pacific, and there was a kind of a divergence of the views between the two countries, and that resulted in the negotiation of the renewal and revision of the U.S. Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. There were kind of structural issues, and that remain as a result of these efforts. The base issues remained, whatever the result of the negotiation was, but there was also an issue of the administrative agreement related to that. The administrative agreement itself was not too bad, but as a result of the existence of the administrative agreement, it resulted in highlighting the base issue in Japan. So how are we going to value and appreciate Yoshida's decision? For instance, in case of overall peace, or not providing bases to the United States. If that had been the choice, the political situation in Japan would have been destabilized because there would be no reason for the U.S. to stay forces in Japan, and the Soviet Union within the post-war framework would exercise its influence on Japan. And that ended up in destabilization of the political situation in Japan, and it would mean more political confrontation inside Japan with the unstable Japan, and in addition to that, in the area of national security, without the presence of the United States or without any logical reason for the stationing of the U.S. forces, it would have been a big issue from the viewpoint of a deterrence. At the end of the day, it would have led to the destability of Japan. I think Yoshida's decision was instrumental in avoiding this kind of situation. In other words, avoiding any political value to be generated. And the stability as a result of all those difficulties, such political vacuum was avoided based on the decision of Mr. Yoshida. The stability of Japan would result in the destability of the region, and that was how the United States interpreted the situation. Therefore, no power vacuum as a result of the choice made by Mr. Yoshida. I think that is something that we need and to value and appreciate. For Japan, the liberal international order led by the United States in the area of economic activities, Japan was able to participate in this the liberal world order that benefited Japan, although joining the United Nations was a little later. And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Associate Professor Kusunoki. Prime Minister Yoshida centered Japan's perspectives were mentioned with regard to this San Francisco peace system. Professor SCHALLER talked about American perspectives. Professor Hatano and Professor Kusunoki talked about the Japanese perspectives to talk about the peace system. The final panelist is Professor Miyashita, which has not been touched upon hardly so far. That is perspectives of France. How did France look at this whole issue? So next, Professor Miyashita. I am with Hosei University. I'm Miyashita. I'll be brief. So why France, first of all? That question may arise in your mind. It's very nitpicking. Details matter, you may think. So you might be wondering about that. As was mentioned earlier, the signing signatories and non-signatories, including all those countries, many countries were involved in the peace system with Japan, and France was one of those countries. And of course, the U.S. has its own idea. So was France. Actually, the whole thing was led by the U.S., but France had its own ideas, I would say. What we can see would be totally different worldview as drawn by France, as well as the image of Japan as drawn by France, which did not realize, of course. But we can see all those perspectives. Why France took interest in the Japan itself as well as the peace system with Japan? One is France was one of the five major countries in 1940s and 1950s. France was one of the major powers in the world. So they did not abandon the strong will to be a major power in the world. So as a major power, it wanted to get involved in the matters in the world. Another thing is, in the present-day France, this is something they also talk about. Asia-Pacific region and Indian Ocean. They are the power in the Asia-Pacific and Indian Ocean region. That's how they position themselves. It's totally not ungroundless at all. As written on the slide, the world's second largest exclusive economic zone is held by France, which is greater than Japan. Why is it available? Not the Mediterranean or the Pacific Ocean. 67% in Pacific Ocean, 26% in Indian Ocean. So, in the vicinity of the Japan's oceanic territories, they have their EEZs. So they have about 7,000 troops placed in that part of the world. Even at present, they emphasize this part of the world, and they place this many troops. So in the past, France had an even higher awareness on the presence in Asia. They were the empire of colonized countries. In 1946, they called the French Union. And at the time, other than Tunisia and Morocco, which is a protectorate of France, and all the other countries joined. So that was a colonial empire at the time, as a French Union. The most important site in the Asian Pacific region was French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. When the issue of the peace system in Japan came up, and France was fighting in the first Indochina War, which means they had its own goal. So they wanted to maintain the empire, which does not have actually the name of empire, so the high-level autonomy. So they wanted to leave all those countries as countries where they can exert influence on. So that means they wanted to establish French-based international order in that part of the world. When they tried to do that, and then surrounding major countries need to be considered, of course. So the major countries in this part of the world was, of course, continental China, Japan, and India in later years. In 1970s, French Foreign Ministry, Oceania, Asia-Oceanic Director said that there are three countries we should pay attention to in Asia. That's what he said in the exchange diaries. And China, Japan, and India. And all the remaining are almost like a dust, he said, comparable to dust. So among the political elites in France, Japan enjoyed a certain level of presence. The third one is 2016. Here it says that France and security in the Asia-Pacific of the Ministry of Armed Forces 2016. Every 2 years in Asia-Pacific, they focus upon what they're aiming for in the Asia-Pacific in every 2 years. So they put out a white paper type of thing. And in 2016 version, France and Asia-Pacific, the first was the San Francisco Peace Treaty in the treaties agreements connecting France and the Asia-Pacific region. So the Japan resumed the diplomacy through a peace system. But when it comes to France, the starting point of the contact with Asia is the San Francisco Peace Treaty in the eyes of France. So when considering the French's memories from the past and think about the future in the Asia, there is a San Francisco Peace Treaty. 2018 version came out just recently. France, Asia. Oh, actually, this item on treaties and agreements connecting France and the Asia-Pacific region was gone. So the latest is 2016 one, so including Japan, France is very interested in Asia, including Japan. So the next is a peace system. But before talking about that, why did they take interest in peace system? when they think about it, what are the arguments? In order to understand them, there are two major incidents or factors. One is the relationship between France and war, that is World War II. The other is reparation-related politics. The post-war France. Now, when we think about it, not just the Asia-Pacific-related diplomacy, but when you think about all the diplomacy as being pushed ahead by France in 1945 or 1945 is not the starting point. In 1940, there was a Free France movement and the defeat of June 1940. Because of that, the Fifth Republic was focused upon under Charles de Gaulle, and the de Gaulleism also was developed as well. In 1940s, in June, there was a defeat of June. In 1940, that was a major one. That was a division of France. The neutral party, that is the Axis branch and the Free France, and was led by de Gaulle. There are two camps in France. So Free France, a branch was located in Japan, even though it was came to a halt rather soon. So de Gaulle focused upon the defeat of June 1940. He wanted to erase that bad memory, so he thought about that. In order to do that, France needs to become a major power. It has to restore its major power status. To do that, the post-war international order needs to be developed, and it needs to join that whole movement. So the most of the energy during the war in France was dedicated to the development of the UN or to join the movement related to the situation in Germany. That was also the same for Asia as well. Even though they were so much deeply involved in German matters, so they were a little bit lagging behind in grappling the issue of Asia. However, in May 15, 1945, after the defeat of Germany, only one after the defeat of Germany, Charles de Gaulle sent a message to Harry Truman showing his eagerness to join the war against Japan. So they made all kinds of efforts possible. However, Japan surrendered regardless of all that. So French did not contribute to Pacific War, ending the Pacific War. So they wanted to get involved in the affairs about Japan, but they failed to do that. They were not able to join developing order in Asia, but they lost that opportunity. And yet, in Indochina, they wanted to remain their presence. They wanted to establish an order in Indochina. So they were having that dilemma. The so-called underlying Japanese problem was used. And this is actually not my coined word. It is appearing in the French diplomacy documents. Of course, there's a German problem. This is in contrast to German problem. So the German problem is another one. So the France in the eyes of France or the France in the eyes of Japan are two different things in that sense. In the post-war era, how did France try to get involved in Japan? They tried to get involved with Japan over reparations. They tried to use Japan during the occupation period. They wanted to secure a presence. They wanted to get involved in the establishment of an order. And another issue is a more practical one, which is compensation or reparations. France was also a theater as well well. So the immediate action was to focus upon restore France. But at the same time, they wanted to focus upon modernization as contrasted with the pre-war era. So modernization was another important component. The father of European integration, that is Jean Monnet, made such a plan for reconstruction modernization. Of course, he's well known for reconstruction of France, but his plan includes colonized areas as well. So he had a plan to change the French Union as well, which required a humongous amount of cost. Marshall Plan was put in place, but that wasn't enough, not enough. Rule international organization, COGS were there, but the steel production was declining in France. So that was the background. French Union's reconstruction or restoration was lagging behind in that sense. Then there's a reparation in goods was expected from Japan. So dismantling the Japanese factories to bring them to various places. If not a factory, there are trucks, railways, trucks that can be brought to Africa. So that was discussed in the commission in France. So toward the end of that period, the French Indochina war deteriorated, and so they wanted some facilities from the Navy of Japan. The Soviet Union dismantled the factories in Manchuria and brought them, or they did the same from East Germany as well. So one of the reasons why France took interest in Japan was benefits to them. Modernization of French Union, including France. For that sake, they wanted to use Japan. Another aspect was the debilitation of Japan. Another over-integration further in Europe is from 48 to 53. That is was the period when discussions were very hotly held for a peace system. Robert Schuman, who served as a foreign minister, with regard to Germany, he said that dismantling the German factories and bring them to France, that is so stupid, he said. It's useless. Still, it is necessary to dismantle German factories. That's what he said. Why he was saying that is because that was to weaken the economic power of Germany, and in place of in place of Germany, France can become the pivotal center of economy in Europe. So there are people who think about the same line of argument about Japan as well. So French Economic Industry Ministry Director, who was in charge of the reparations of Japan, talked about compensation with goods to weaken the fabric of Japan's industry base. Instead, Indochina can be the base for the industrialization in Asia. So that was the initial idea in France. Needless to say, such an idea, in 1947, there was a policy change by the USA, so the France idea did not prevail. Because of the occupation policy changed by the US, the situation changed. And peace with Japan, that means signing the peace treaty with Japan, that idea came upon France as well. So France got on that bandwagon. But did they really follow the US? Not necessarily. Reparations. The idea that I mentioned was maintained by France. As Professor Sakamoto talked about war responsibility, the UK even retreated from the withdrawal of the war responsibility. France stuck to that. Also, they also insisted on inserting a clause prohibiting rearmament, so Article 9 of the Constitution was also referred to as a need. And refusal of reciprocity was also mentioned by France in the most favored nation treatment. Why is it that all that happened? They objected the rearmament of Japan because they had a concern over the precedent of a German rearmament. In Europe, there was an issue of German rearmament. So that's the basic, the same idea. So the U.S. wanted to have an early rearmament of Germany, but France objected it. So if the Japan is rearmed, and then the German can be rearmed as well. So they wanted to stop that no matter what. They needed some wording for that. Depending upon the diplomats, collective security, not just individual security, but collective security should be prohibited by Japan, of Japan as well. There were some French diplomats who were saying that. Of course, the France understood the Cold War, but they did not want the prolongation of the Cold War. Mr. Schuman was an anti-communist fighter, so he hated communism. Having said that, however, they wanted to did not realize a situation where the deterioration between the Soviet Union and the U.S. would be taking place. Even under the Vienna system, they were not all on good terms with each other. There were conflicts with one another, but at the same time, they wanted to make the dialogue possible among those countries. So France, Foreign Minister Schuman, was drawing such a similar picture. So he was opposing to the peace system with Japan, but he did not want to excite or instigate the Soviet Union. So when Dallas visited Paris, he mentioned that, but Dallas flatly rejected it. The U.S. wants to emphasize the friendly relationship with France. But if France asks which friendly relationship the U.S. would opt for, then Dallas said that he would opt for the friendly relationship with Japan. That's what he said to the high-ranking official in the U.S. So the logic of World War II was employed by France, but the U.S. was thinking in terms of the Cold War logic. And of course, France had an understanding about the Cold War situation, but they did not want to be overwhelmed by that Cold War logic, even though eventually they were bulldozed by the idea of Cold War logic. But there was such a difference in ideas. With regard to San Francisco Peace Conference, Treaty Conference, when Schuman joined that conference, he said that that is unusual conference, even though he was praising Dallas, but he said that Dallas just did it on his own. What France wanted to do was to hold a meeting properly. When concluding a peace treaty, Palmer, Stone, like a chairman, can hold some meetings, but when such a meeting is held, at least gathering the major countries' representatives, the Far East Commission members should be gathered to have such a meeting, and that was not possible. So he made it an issue. So international law scholars in France in 1953 said that this is a revolutionary treaty, which is totally different from the traditional custom of holding such a meeting. So this was a rather unconventional treaty for France. Finally, the post-peace treaty, and there are some resentment over this. For example, Free France compensation issue remained, and the joining the GATT by Japan was one of the milestones for Japan. Japan gave importance to that. And of course, the French supported However, they wanted to reserve the most favored nation treatment and national treatment. So substantially they opposed such a status of Japan. In 1964, that issue was resolved. So up until 1964, France followed the logic of World War II. Or they did not consider Japan to be a friendly country. So there was such underlying trends in France. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The panel discussion has to end at 3:05. Because of my poor chairmanship, that time is very limited now. But from the organizer, since we started this session a little bit late than scheduled, so I would like to extend this session by 10 minutes. So we are going to end the session at 3:15. With your understanding, thank you. And the second part will start as scheduled at 3:30. So we are going to have, we have 17 minutes left for this session. So how are you going to utilize this remaining 17 minutes? As we planned, I want to ask Professor SCHALLER to comment. But perhaps most likely, the panelists. We have 4 panelists. Perhaps it is impossible for him to give a very detailed and thorough response to the 4 presentations, but to the extent possible, I would like Professor SCHALLER to make a comment. Please.
Thank you. Let me just say a few things. One is the importance of domestic politics and understanding some of this. Certainly on the U.S. side, we've always concentrated on foreign policy, trying to understand the U.S.-Japan relationship. But during the negotiations for the peace and security treaties and afterwards, domestic politics also entered. Even though Japan was never the center of partisan dispute in the United States, the way China was, for example, in the late 1940s, there was still a great deal of residual resentment against Japan, and it could be seen in certain ways, such as the fact that it was actually surprisingly difficult for Dulles to get the U.S. Senate to approve the security and peace treaties. As again, it didn't happen until almost 5 or 6 months after the actual signing of the treaty. And even then, the U.S. Senate, both Democrats and Republicans, insisted that Japan acknowledged that it would not sign a peace settlement with the People's Republic, that it would accept strict limits on trade with China. These were sort of prerequisites for Senate approval of the peace settlement. So this was something of a domestic issue in the United States, just as the split between the American military and American civilians were. It drove Dulles crazy that every time he thought he had nailed down a settlement, the Joint Chiefs of Staff raised the ante. They insisted on more bases, on more special privileges. And he often commented it was much more difficult dealing with the American military than it was dealing with America's allies or the Japanese. One other point raising about Yoshida's attempt, his go-slow rearmament proposals. One thing to remember is that the timing of that, Yoshida's reluctance to rearm substantially was also based on the Korean War. He was terribly afraid that once a Japanese military was created, the Americans would pressure Japan to fight in Korea. And that, I think it's attributed to him that once he asked why, it would be put off for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And he said, because then the Korean War would finally be over. And that was a crucial thing. All of Yoshida's successors from all political factions sort of shared this, the fear that the U.S. would look upon a Japanese military as some sort of mercenary force to police Asia. And that was also a constraint upon Japanese rearmament that was shared broadly among Japanese political factions. One other thing about the separation of the peace and security treaties I'd like to comment on, because that's been referred to, is that just as I talked about Russia nesting dolls as a metaphor for all these treaties, the security peace treaty and administrative agreement were sort of a pyramid of issues. The peace treaty was a more or less international agreement. The security treaty was a bilateral agreement that really had relatively little to do with the defense of Japan. It was the projection of American power in East Asia and the Pacific. And then the administrative agreement, of course, wasn't a treaty at all. It was a signature between officials in governments. And part of that was because each of these treaties was less popular than the other. The peace treaty was broadly popular in Japan. The security treaty less so, and of course the administrative agreement least popular of all, given its lack of Japanese jurisdiction over American military personnel. One other point I would just make is that it's difficult to categorize, but throughout this period, from the late 40s really through the 1960s or 70s, there was an issue of double containment. Americans, seldom publicly, but often privately, even Dulles himself, talked about the fact that the security relationship between the U.S. and Japan was not only designed to protect Japan, but it was designed to protect others from Japan. It wasn't just the Australians and New Zealanders or Filipinos who talked about that, but Americans did as well. Often not in public, but often privately. In the late 1950s, Dulles said that he despite his talk of pushing rearmament, he said, sometimes I wonder if it's wise to push rearmament on Japan. What if they turn their guns in the wrong direction? He speculated. In 1972, when Richard Nixon went to China, much of the focus of his talk with Mao and Zhou Enlai was the Japanese security treaty. Mao and Zhou, of course, were pressing for the elimination of that treaty, and it was Richard Nixon who had pushed for Japanese rearmament in the 1950s. In 1972, told Mao and Zhou, the real purpose of the security treaty is not anti-Chinese, it's anti-Japanese. It's designed to put constraints on a resurgent Japan. And he said to Mao and Zhou, do you really want us to eliminate that treaty? The bases in Japan and around Japan are really the means for stabilizing East Asia. The last thing China should want was the elimination of that treaty. It gave Mao and Zhou something to think about. Obviously, today the dynamics have changed again, but these were all factors that I think are important to keep in mind. And one last point. During the 1950s, I alluded to how President Eisenhower was surprisingly sympathetic to some of Japan's concerns. And at one point, when American textile manufacturers were complaining about Japanese blouse exports to the United States, Eisenhower gathered a group of manufacturers together, and he said, you know, we face an issue. Japan can sell, and I'm paraphrasing, Japan can sell battleships to Beijing or blouses to American women. Which would we rather have them do? And he said American manufacturers would have to adjust to this reality. Thank you.
ありがとうございました。全体にかかる
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for mentioning very important points very briefly. We were able to deepen further understanding about the situation. All the presentations given now are based on the state-of-the-art research, based on the recently made available primary source materials. They were all in high quality. So we wanted to have more time and listen to the views of the panel even further, but I have come to 3:05 now, so I have only 9 minutes remaining, or maybe slightly less than 10 minutes. I have that time available for that session. So I would like to have a question and answer. I wish we were able to have a discussion among the panelists until 3. That was the permission I was given, but we are already past the 3 p.m., so we won't be able to conduct real panel discussion. Perhaps we can entertain questions from 2 to 3 people. So please identify yourself and identify to whom you address your questions. A microphone will be brought to you. So please raise your hand if you have a question. Anybody? Any question?
じゃあ一番前の川島。
Professor Kawashima. in the front row. My name is Kashima of Tokyo University. I have one question each and for Professor Hatano and Professor, and on page 8, the peace system or Kowa Taisei, the San Francisco peace system, but in the resume, the San Francisco is not attached. Is this the same meaning? Now, for example, Japan Soviet joint communique. It is not identically based on the peace treaty. Now, as for joint communique between Japan and China, there should be a lot of this should be included in the system, San Francisco system. I think that requires a lot of discussion. And Professor Miyashita, I think this is something I would like to ask in the second half of this symposium. When it comes to France, as you may know, the France's position, or the French position, is deeply related to Asia Pacific, in particular when it comes to Southeast Asia. The Spratly Islands were occupied by the Japanese military in the pre-war days, and those renounced islands. Now, the Spratly Islands were included in the text, and then Shinnan-gunto or Spratly Islands. When this word was inserted in the text, and according to the Sino-Japanese the peace treaty, that the ROC was really insistent on this topic, and as for this term, that the Spratly Islands, when that word was inserted in the text, did any action was taken by France? And another point is that France, I think 1962 is a very important, 1964 is a very important turning point, that there was a normalization of the relations in 1964. And how this kind of a turning point have impact on the relationship with the France? And there is another question, a gentleman raising his hand. Thank you very much. My name is Akita of Nikkei newspaper. I'm a journalist. So from the viewpoint of the current situation, and coming back into the past history and the modern meaning of those days, my question is addressed to anyone. One Japanese expert and Professor SCHALLER, so those two gentlemen. The Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, as a result of this Cold War, the generous offer was made at the same time. Because of the Cold War at the same time, there was an equal the relationship between the United States and Japan, the stationing of U.S. forces in Japan. I think there are different ways to describe the situation. For example, the Cold War between China and the United States, this situation would worsen furthermore. And from backcasting from the present day into the past, the current U.S.-Japan security treaty. And if the Cold War situation worsens between China and the United States, how the situation is going to develop in terms of the U.S.-Japan security treaty into the future. And Professor Hatano and Professor Miyashita, and then Professor SCHALLER and Professor KUSUNOKI. 5 minutes for each experts. Thank you very much. As you have mentioned, now this is San Francisco peace system, and then the peace system, which is another line in the resume. There are differences of the wording. But first, overall, in 1978, that there is a kind of the continuity of agreements up until this Japan-China friendship and treaty. I think the original point was the legal system that was born out of the San Francisco system. As you mentioned, as for the Japan and China joint communique and the joint declaration of Japan and the Soviet Union, they may be different, but when it comes to the issue of reparations, they were discussed and there was a kind of a consistency of the interpretation, and therefore I should say that those two treaties are also included or embraced in the San Francisco system. And if my interpretation is applied, then the things that come up until today may not be easily understood. For example, that 1972 system when it comes to China and Japan, which is somewhat different from the past the trend. And I think that can be also applied to 1965 ROK-Japan relationship. When it is interpreted from the viewpoint of claims and property, I should say that there is a kind of a continuity throughout all those agreements. And there was a Supreme Court judgment that was rendered in 2007, and that can be embraced within that framework.
Thank you very much for your question, Professor Kawashima. With regard to your first question, I mentioned this time for the France succeeded in the revisions, and I did not mention those two factors for their France succeeding in two revisions. That one is related to South China Sea issue. There are other issues as well. Manchuria, Northern Territories. What territories is Japan going to abandon? So that should be well put it in writing. That is the idea of a French foreign ministry at the time. However, they did not give so much importance to that one. However, South China Sea issues priority was higher. More than that, they made even greater efforts for associate states issue. Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, these three countries should be invited as signatory countries, and they succeeded in doing that. But I wanted to talk about the international order, so I skipped those aspects. The second point is a very challenging question. I tried to check on it, but I may have forgot it, or I was not able to find so many relevant materials. I don't remember that clearly. San Francisco Peace Treaty was discussed. I think France was wanted to invite the continental China. The reason is very simple. Because China should not pose a threat to Indochina. It's a very similar relationship against the Soviet Union. So France did not want to instigate China, even though they do not like China. So to the extent possible, France wanted to adopt a flexible approach. So rather than talking about Japan itself, but they did not want any escalation of the situation surrounding Japan. Then what about 1964? How is that related to this whole situation? The president was de Gaulle. I wonder. The Asian issue will be further discussed in part 2. So, Professor Miyashita, if you like, while listening to the discussions in part 2, if you could raise your points from the French perspectives, I'd appreciate it. And Professor SCHALLER will be also serving as commentator as well in the part 2. So, Mr. Akita's questions from Nikkei Shimbun newspaper will be very important from the contemporary point of view as the advent development of China is taking place, how we should perceive the San Francisco peace system. So as a commentator, I would like Professor SCHALLER to talk about that particular aspect in part 2 as well. We are already running out of time, but Professor Sakamoto and Professor Kusunoki are present only in part 1. So if you have some last remarks, please do so.
Can I take up some time for my remarks? Well, I try to be brief. The Professor SCHALLER mentioned toward the end of his remarks. So if Japan is defeated, the U.S. has to go up to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, MLA. So I think this is the what Williams written about, and I think this is about the dynamism of the United States. Maybe this is a tragedy of dynamism. Westward movement, go west, young man, and grow up with nation. That is the slogan of the United States. How can I say that was a national trait of the American people? And to what extent are they going to the west? Well, at the end of the west, this is Japan, which has a strategic importance. And how are we going to view China in this case? So when they withdrew from Vietnam, they had to sign a treaty with China. At that time, China had power. However, there was no maritime power yet. So when China gains maritime power, then China needs to be contained. That is the current situation. The means of containment now, just like the Soviet-related containment in the initial stage, using economic power. In the case of Japan, in the previous time, the assistance to Japan or to European countries, the assistance could be used as a means. But this time, today, trade is used as a means of containment. So the similar situation is perhaps occurring, similar to San Francisco-related situation. Thank you. So in the second session, Professor SCHALLER is going to respond to Professor Sakamoto's point, and he's going to make a comment toward the end of the second session as well. Professor Kusunoki, just one word.
Very briefly. Well, in terms of Yoshida's selections, the best within a limited situation, so it was nothing to do with Yoshida's doctrine. So it is difficult to have insights into today's world, and it is difficult for me to elaborate on that. But if there is any meaning, if any, I think Yoshida grasped the long-term perspective of the Cold War. The hot war was temporary, and there was a psychic war that would continue. That was his statement. And in the 1950s, the Cold War was represented by a confrontation in the political area. So I think that was kind of the very accurate scrutiny of the situation that was possible for him. I'm sorry for the unskillful management of today's session. It was prolonged. That we are going to take a break, and then the second part is going to start at 35. And thank you very much, and for a very important suggestions made at this session. I would like you to give them a round of applause. Thank you very much, and my thanks go unto all the panelists and the moderator. And we are going to resume at 3:35. There will be drinks available at the back of this room. Thank you very much.